Good morning. I want to welcome everybody to our Master Symposium, Speculative Futures, Are We Burning Our Past?, organized by the Department of Fine Arts of the Zurich University of the Arts. I just want to stress that I'm very happy that given the circumstances we are all in, we are still able to do this symposium, even if online. And for that, I want to thank all of our guests that showed a very great deal of flexibility in order to make this happen. But I also want to thank everybody who helped organize the symposium. I want to mention Rabea Riedelhammer, which was a very great help, and of course also everybody from the Secretariat of the Department of Fine Arts. So thank you very much to make this happen. I just want to say a few words as a kind of introduction, and then of course we are going to start with our first keynote. The symposium takes as a starting point the observation that a persistent discourse of catastrophe and crisis modes has prompted the ever more frequent emergencies of new ethnofuturism, which confront the impasse of our time with radical technological and political scenarios of the future. The Master Symposium, Speculative Futures, Are We Burning Our Past?, asks whether there has been an overall rethinking of time or the future and a departure from the conventional linear chronology of past, present, and future. Such an asynchronous conception of time also lies at the basis of several strands of contemporary philosophies, especially so-called materialist or speculative one. Just think of, I want to just mention one example, Quentin Meillassoux' concept of time and the past when he says the past is unpredictable, as the past conceived asynchronously has never been, it never was present, and it will be accessible only from the future. In a talk Sadie Plant gave just a few weeks ago here in Switzerland, she spoke of such speculative philosophy as a pure philosophy that somehow remains, and I quote her, indifferent to human affairs, indifferent to real people's life, real economies, and real commodities, end of quote. She questions the sense of real production, of real knowledge production, and real making that results from speculative thinking. In order to reflect on such an eligible critique, I would like to use a thought concept elaborated by our first speaker of the day, Armen Avanessian, namely that of a speculative poetic reflection. From the perspective of such an asynchronous poetics of time, Avanessian stresses that, and I quote, necessity of thinking a plurality of histories, including histories of our present. Every present is asynchronous and contingent in itself, and it will therefore always be more than one past. There is not one present, and there are always pasts different from the past described by history. To poeticize the history thus means primarily that our task, our ethical and political task, is to produce new pasts in writing, end of quote. I think that such a speculative poetic reflection goes hand in hand with the question of how artists reflect on, prefigure, and or invoke sociocultural implications and transformations, or to be more precise, on how artists work in a speculative manner in order to actually make and produce those changes and transformations. In this line of thought, this Master Symposium, Speculative Futures, focuses on the concept beginning with the future for the sake of a better present, in contrast to scenarios that seek a better future from the perspective of the present. However, this future centrism does not mean losing sight of important political and cultural questions resulting and relating to the past, as seen, for example, in post-colonial discourse. History is not the past. As the historian John Henry Clarke observed, history is important to our present and future. And here I quote Clarke, "History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells a people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most important, history tells people where they will still must go, what they still must be." End of quote. Historical events and our knowledge about them shape our understanding of our world today and our notions of what may lie ahead. One imperative question then is, which stories are told and whose stories are heard or end up being suppressed consciously or unconsciously? How do we deal with different voices and ambivalences? Who is at the center and who remains outside at the margins? As Bell Hooks points out, I quote, "As subjects, people have the right to define their own reality, establish their own identities, name their history. As objects, one's reality is defined by others, one's identity created by others, one's history named only in ways that defines one's relationship to those who are subjects." End of quote. Oppressive boundaries set by race, gender, sexuality, and class domination need to be questioned, challenged, and deconstructed. There is a need for what one could call speculative counter-narratives. A way of producing or making those speculative counter-narratives might be to, I quote, "imagine history as an open work," as Elvira Diange-Ozé, one of our symposium guests, suggests. Following Umberto Eco's notion of the open work, Elvira Diange-Ozé asks, and I quote, "If openness and indeterminacy are true possibilities for the production of history, how then does history make its subject?" End of quote. Who or what would be the collective subject of history? And she goes on, I quote again, "If given the opportunity to be such a history teller, how does one make the opportunity to be such a history teller? How does one mark relevant the collective memories, personal narratives, inner worlds, stories, and protagonists located within the margins of history?" End of quote. In fact, these questions attain new relevance under the auspices of current debates. Climate change, for example, poses a threat not only to future generations. We are burning our past while we destroy our future. Who pays the toll for climate change? To what extent does it affect different people differently based on their national or cultural context? What natural heritage are we obliterating? The Master Symposium, Speculative Futures, will interrogate counter-future and present future. What artistic and technological possibilities can be harnessed to the end? Who sets the narrative? How can future scenarios be imagined away from hegemonic subjectivities? And what is the relationship between democracy and time? So, without further ado, I would like to start the conversation with the philosopher Armen Avanessian, our first guest of the day. Instead of doing a long introduction, I decided it might be much nicer, I would say, to include some of the thoughts already in the introduction, but also in my questions. And I just want to say that Armen Avanessian is currently a visiting professor at the HBFK Hamburg and runs also a weekly theory series at Volksbühne Berlin. So, Welcome to the ZHDK or online live. So thank you very much, Armen Avanessian, for being here today. And yeah, as I said, I would try to incorporate some of your, I would say, biographical informations into my questions. And yeah, I just wanted to stress that you are the editor of a book series at Merbe Verlag Berlin called Speculations. And one of the most recent published books in this collection is called Ethnofuturism, that was edited as part of Speculations. So maybe you can say a little bit on how this series is functioning, but also something more specific on this particular publication.
I hope you can hear me. Also, the camera is somehow in the right position. So first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation, the introduction. Very interesting introduction. So we also to the tech team, organizing a lot of events myself. I know like how COVID is, apart from all other annoyances, is a nightmare for organizing conferences. The idea that we had, and this is announced as a keynote, but the idea that we had is rather to have a kind of conversation in the spirit of the workshops and the whole symposium. So even though there were last-minute changes, so to say, we'll keep. We stay within that spirit, and given that which is often the case, the philosopher starts speaking. I also try. We thought that we should avoid pretending that this is a kind of like philosophical foundation of then artistic workshops and so on, but rather the idea is to open some trajectories and not define for once and for all like what the future is, or the concept of future, or ethnofuturisms. That's very important. It always has to be in the plural. So yeah, these are just some preliminary remarks. Because it's a shame that we cannot sit together and work together. Especially one person with whom I edited the book on ethnofuturism. This is something I always say, and when I speak about the topic, Mahan Moalemi, a young Iranian curator, who made me first like aware of the broadness of the concept and the phenomena related to this ethnofuturisms, and to whom I'm also indebted in various regards. But so basically, all the interesting things I'll say are coming from him, and everything, all the mistakes, do blame me. Yeah, so you asked me about this the book series that I started a couple of years ago. Yeah, there are several books on philosophical movements or trajectories that you mentioned, like specrealism, accelerationism, and others. This specific book on ethnofuturism, and also where I met like Mahan, my later to be co-editor, came out of a long workshop series. Actually, that's maybe interesting to say. And relevant, given that we are here not in a kind of philosophical academic surrounding, but an artistic one. So the way I met him, and also it was in Berlin as part of a young curators workshop I organized for the second last, I think, Berlin Biennial, that was dedicated to topics of I think the title was Post-Contemporary Art, questions about already, or as always in my work, but maybe questions of temporality and also transformations within the art world, both institutionally but also economically. And one of the focus points were really what I call a complex or speculative temporality, and no longer linear or chronological temporality. And the book was published like partly for the biennial and in German also for Merve. I mentioned this a bit because for me it's always important, like where things come into existence, like and who are the protagonists and how do they work and how do they also economically survive or organize their work. And so it's important to say that it's not just coming out of an artistic context, also the authors of the book, so to say, are in the majority musicians, visual artists, and no longer like the traditional academic philosophers that are then translated or spread into the art world. Rather, Ethnofuturisms is, and also the protagonist of various strands of Ethnofuturism, like Afrofuturism, Sinofuturism, and so on, are artists, musicians. So I think that's something we should somehow keep in mind, if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll come back to one or two things you just mentioned, maybe also the question of the post-contemporary art. But first I wanted to ask, because maybe you can say a little bit more about the relation between some of the traditions or, let's say, genealogies you just mentioned or alluded, because already in the titles that are published within the series, you just said speculative realism, accelerationism, but there's also one title called Sinofuturism. So, could you maybe say a little bit more about how the ethnofuturism incorporate themselves within this genealogies?
Yeah. I mean, the proper philological answer would be the proper academic philological answer would be like, well, some of the protagonists are overlapping. So you have some people working together in the 90s or so in Warwick, like Mark Fisher or Ray Brassier, and they also become part of the accelerationist movement, whatever it is or was, and or their students become like protagonists in other directions. So there is this kind of like very simple relationship between these different strands, including some theoreticians, so to say, of ethnofuturisms. The more philosophical and more interesting, I guess, reply. But I mean, if I say people like Ray Brassier and Mark Fisher, of course, that means that they also have something in common. They were not just like friends or happening to be at the same place at the same time, but rather something that Mark Fisher famously by now called in his capitalist realism book retrospective confabulations, as something typical for capitalist realism. This idea, I mean, the most famous or infamous version of it is Make America Great Again. So what's typical for capitalist realism is this kind of constant, apparently counterintuitive, because one of the slogans is always like creative destruction and moving forward, but it relates to a not just latently but manifestly racist idea of a past that existed in a certain way, identities that have their roots in the past and can be identified and that also remain like the same over history. So this kind of retrospective confabulations as a sign of capitalist realism is something that all of them were somehow fighting against or trying to think against. I happen to disagree with this, as you can imagine, what you put it down, like Sadie Plan's impression that speculative philosophies remain indifferent to practical work or to more concrete topics. I mean, from speculative design, but Ben Breton to Donna Haraway, these are all, speculative philosophy is a much broader trend, I would say, than just some speculative realist philosophers. But maybe these are two academic ways of replying. So philosophically, if one thinks about the relation between, or the genealogies, as you called it, between speculative realism, accelerationism, xenofeminism, ethnofuturism, and so on, would be, and with regards to our topics, that there's a questioning of time. I already mentioned the Mark Fisher idea. You quoted Meillassoux and the idea that we have to that the past is something that can be that is not like given once and for all. And I think something that is key for me here is one equation that identifies capitalism with progress, with modernism, and with acceleration and other things. And I think this is a very unhelpful, and I spoke a lot about it and published about it. I think this equation that is so dominant or nearly hegemonic needs to be broken. Capitalism is not that progressive. On the other hand, we should not abandon the idea of progress and the idea of enlightenment, as if it's necessarily linked to its racist components that are obviously there, its misogynic components that are obviously there, and the same way we should not abandon the whole idea of progress just because we only know it in its capitalist kind of version or variation, so to say. So what all these different groups or movements, I won't mention them all these isms again, what they all share is both philosophically but also in case of xenofeminism, a kind of feminist or a political resistance to oversimplified notions of time. And in the case of ethnofuturism, which is a bit the main, the focus of our panel, of this kind of introductory keynote, I think it's one opposition that I was very interested in getting beyond. Not just me, but like I got interested in ethnofuturism as a kind of possibility, getting beyond the either-or of a kind of neoliberal multiculturalism, which somehow is related to the fantasy of a post-ethnic, post-historical future, in the idea of an end of history and the end of different ethnicities. So that is the kind of Washington consensus ideology of neoliberal multiculturalism. Or, on the other hand, a kind of neo-reactionary ethnopluralism. And that is, to put it very shortly, there the idea is, well, there's different cultures, there's different races, there are different ethnicities. Let them be different, but let's separate them. Let them be in different places, right? Again, this is Make America Great Again, and the Mexicans stay there as if they haven't been there much before, and so on. And the question is between this neoliberal and this neo-reactionary two strands, like how can we move beyond? What are the alternatives? And it's interesting that it's coming out of like artistic speculations and artistic work that some of the most interesting, at least attempts coming from to move beyond this alternative that is still, let me be clear, that is still the dominant one. And I think even in post-colonial studies, there's still a very strong trend of being caught in the trap of this either-or. Yeah, yeah. You should. Yeah. So that it was okay. Yeah, basically that is good that you interrupted me because I have a tendency of giving 60 minutes answers. But that was a bit the reason why after having edited these other books, I thought that it makes sense within this time philosophical genealogy to continue also with the book on ethnofuturism because it opened up new trajectories.
Well, I mean, given on what you just said, I was just wondering because you're writing, but you're also saying that we have to think the present from the future, or you even say we have to meet the future halfway. So could you maybe say a little bit more by what you mean exactly when you're saying this?
Is this okay now? Yeah. Now I'm always watching you because also there's not so many people here, so I stare at you. What it means to meet the future halfway, this sounds odd maybe, but like I've been talking so much about this that I try not to repeat myself. So it's some basic ideas, you know, after decades of a kind of postmodern obsession with the various posts, you know, I got interested at one point in pre's, you know, and especially the notion of the preemptive. That we are preemptive personalities, that there are recommendation algorithms that know things about us before we know it, that we have preemptive wars, we have a proactive medicine that is telling us to change the modalities of this symposium before we get ill or so. So we're constantly like counting in the future, not just based on weird assumptions, but or speculations in the everyday way of understanding the term, but really based on scientific calculations, on simulations, and on algorithmic calculations. And in that way, for me, it's not sci-fi. To say that we have to think from the future or we have to meet the future halfway, but rather in the way J.G. Ballard once said, sci-fi is the better realism, right? The problem is so many people are complaining about the lack of future. The problem is, and it's completely right that you said, like when we burning the past, burning the resources of the past means also burning the future. So I would agree with that. But on the other hand, we have, and I just mentioned algorithms, and we have a lot of future, and one could even turn it around and say we have too much future that we don't know how to deal with. Like, what do we do with all the knowledge about the future? So in that sense, again, I think William Gibson is another sci-fi author, said like the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed, and obviously the data that we produce and the knowledge about the future that this implies is not evenly distributed. You know, there's some who own it and who are able to use it. So in that sense, these are from meeting the future halfway and thinking from the future and acting from the future is something that is already done. So it's not a kind of, oh, again, a philosopher with a weird idea, but it's rather like we as individuals, as philosophers, as artists, as political subjects, as society, we gotta like scale up and get on the level of like what is already done on a techno-political level, so to say. And with regards to ethnofuturism, I thought it's very interesting against a trend. Maybe I oversimplify, but against the trend of being so futurophobic or so skeptical about the future. That a term like futurism is a total non-go in our culture for good reasons, because the historical Western, Middle European futurisms, they were like racist, misogynistic, warmongering doctrines. I mean, not only, but like so there was a reason why they led into or fed into historical fascism. So in a moment when future, both in the sense as a concept, but also in the sense of a category that is connotated in a positive way, is disappearing in the global north or in the west for all the reasons I mentioned it. At the same time, there are new futurisms popping up. And they're popping up at places, and they're popping up in cultures and related to ethnicities that are that were traditionally thought of being incapable of even having a concept of time. And traditionally, 19th and 20th century racist Western concepts of different cultures. So Afrofuturism, Sinofuturism, Gulf-Futurism, and others, for me it was striking that on the one hand futurisms disappearing, and on the other hand popping up where they don't belong, according to an old to a traditional Western or Occidental, aka also racist, colonial understanding. And the important question now is that just a historical coincidence? Is this relevant or not? And I think it's more than relevant, because what's at stake is like, how can we, and this relates to what some of the things I said at the beginning, how can we think about like freedom? How can we think about emancipation? How can we think about progress without falling back into a kind of old-fashioned and reactionary logic of progress? And the answer is it's symptomatic, and it's interesting, and it's revealing, and there's more than an element of truth that this has to come, like new ideas about progress need to come from outside. Let's say Europe and Northern America, where the idea of progress was traditionally based. So the idea, a new understanding of history, of producing history, a new idea of emancipation, also new political subjects of the 21st century. I think that's very important. And there's a lot of struggles now around, like not just Fridays for Future, but also the so-called refugee crisis, which is like the wrong term, but also around Black Lives Matters and so on. They are all indicators that the progressive elements and the progressive new subjects in the strong Rancierian sense, that a new subject appears and says like, knock on the door, I'm here to speak. I'm part of this kind of polis. I'm part of this democratic society, and part of a society that is not willing to let anyone in. You know, I think that it's very important to investigate these ethnofuturisms, because they don't just have an interesting concept of future, but they are the guiding kind of the avant-garde, so to say, of a new understanding of emancipation and thinking about the present in a futuristic, but progressive futuristic way.
Well, thank you for that. Before I'm going to ask you to actually maybe say even a little bit more about the different or specific ethnofuturism, I would like to squeeze in another question, because you just mentioned again this question of producing history, of making history, you know, also what I was kind of trying to reference in my introduction, this difference between what Sadie Plant is saying, that the speculative remains indifferent to human affairs, because I sense that what you actually understand as being a speculative thinking is actually something very, I would say, hands-on in a specific way. And I was just wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more on this, because I think this is something also very important if we think about what and how those counter-histories or counter-narratives can be produced, can be made, and what it would mean to do that. And yeah, I was just wondering if maybe this idea of the poetics you worked on and elaborated in your work, if this goes into this direction, or yeah, can you maybe say a little bit more on this?
Yeah, we're somehow circling around the individual ethnofuturisms, which also somehow makes sense, because it's best to investigate them or confront oneself with them by the artistic contributions that actually produce them. I mean, you were asking me about. I wouldn't say that what I do is hands-on. I mean, I even write like finger on only. So it's still theory. But like for me, that's not opposed to practice. Producing theory means actually also inventing things and faking things, poetic, the etymological meaning of poetics is from poiesis. That means really producing some truth, like making something real, putting it into real, putting it into reality in a way. So theory for me is not just understanding something that exists, but it means like producing. Of course, ethnofuturisms don't exist. Accelerationism did not exist. But nor did structuralism. These are inventions that become real. I think when we one term that is very important for all the movements and most of the protagonists that we spoke about with regards to what you were asking now is hyperstition. It's not clear like who came up with it. Like one of the suspects is Mark Fisher, but what hyperstitions and I think ethnofuturisms also are hyperstitions. What hyperstitions are is they are it's a mix of hype and superstition, and what they're qualified by is it's fictions that have a capacity of realizing themselves, to make themselves real, but obviously like from the future. Can I was just like preparing while they did the tech setup. I have a long quote by Luciana Parisi. I don't know how much time we don't have a lot of time. I give a short quote about hyperstition. So that's Luciana Parisi, who was also part of a group of people, some of I already mentioned, but also Kojo Eshun, Steve Goodman, Mark Fisher, of the CCRU in Warwick in the 90s. And in 2016, she speaks about the 90s. Quote, ideas of no future, the idea of capitalist realism, as for instance in Mark Fisher, were then developed. This kind of haunting time, the question of time and tapping into the capitalist capacity of anticipating desires, of becoming an engine of potential realities, was already producing a simulated future for you. The kind of realism that this is the everyday and there is no possibility of utopian discourse or utopian reappropriation or political resistance to capital. A sort of inevitable pessimism that could become hyper-realized to open other dimensions of existence, dragging you out into a larger black hole. What you could do is expose the realism of capital and its intelligence in order to embrace the human condition as fundamentally alienated from the ontology of being and from the narratives of political projects that would deny the original alienation of the human under the obliterating destruction of capital. Hyperstition was an invention of the CCRU in terms of to make our own future. Invent the future, name the future to come. It was a kind of super constructivist, and in this sense I thought about it when you asked for the production of the past or different futures. It was a kind of super constructivist intervention in time. Hyperstition is a mode of articulating futurity within the present, but not futurity in terms of a future to come, but the actuality of future, so meeting the future halfway. Extrapolating as much potentially as possibly from the present, constraining, conditioning techno-determinism, techno-fascism, techno-racism, all that, extrapolating these potentialities to reverse engineer them. We talked about reverse engineering of hyperstition, to engineer time, the future, the present by other means. Sorry for the long quote by Luciana Parisi. And I think what she says here about like hyperstition, both about the construction and the invention of ethnofuturisms as if they would all exist, as if they would all have something in common. They don't necessarily do. They're very different. Well, I mean, the most well known, and also the one with the biggest like already history and heritage is surely Afrofuturism, and Sun Ra, the musician and filmmaker Sun Ra, is really the person to follow here, and its main theoreticians are people like already mentioned Kojo Eshun, who doesn't just want to abandon the idea of counter-memory, but wants to, in a way, add to it, or whose claim is that we also need like counter-futures. and not just focus on the past. Ariadne, who wrote a very, I think, polemic and interesting article about black accelerationism, relating to something that you call the question: who is the collective subject of history? So who's the subject of progress? And according to her, it's not the white male proletarian, as in Marx, but it is the black person, the black worker, and so on. So it's Sun Ra with his idea, and these more recent theoreticians that are relevant with regards to Afrofuturism. Just to give you one basic idea, it's not a methodology, but like a way of if you know his films and his music, what's specific about him is this mix of both mythological elements of the past and future technologies, and the way he confronts them and tries to reinvent like history, but also reinvent like his own narration. Very different to that, also with its also from in terms of like politics is a phenomenon of Gulf-Futurism. I think for the first conference that was planned, you invited also Monira Al-Qadiri, and so it's her who wrote an interesting text about the Dubaification of the world, her sister Fatima, but most of all Sofia Al-Maria, and for them the Gulf zone somehow exemplifies like certain elements in reality, already in the present, that the so-called West, or the Northern Hemisphere, imagines as futuristic or as the future. But the idea was also that instead of saying more, maybe we show a clip towards the end on Sinofuturism by Lawrence Legg, because I think it's very much self-explanatory, and to at least have one example. I give you just one quote from a conversation Lawrence Legg had with Steve Goodman, aka DJ Code 9, who also wrote interesting articles on Sinofuturism. So this time a short quote. He's been exploring this idea of non-Western futures for a very long time. So I asked him, why is it that there is no Sinofuturism? And then we were talking about how, if the symbol of Afrofuturism is this super robot or hyperhuman, there's no equivalent for Sinofuturism. And that conversation really got me thinking, and I realized that actually the robot is for Afrofuturism what AI is for Sinofuturism. And I think this is we are running out of time, so I might say thank you, but if I'm not in the picture anymore afterwards. So this is Lawrence Legg, I think, from 2016.
Sinofuturism. Sinofuturism is a visible movement, a sector already embedded into a trillion industrial products, a billion individuals, and a million veiled narratives. It is a movement not based on individuals, but on multiple overlapping flows. Flows of populations, of products, and of processes. Because Sinofuturism has arisen without conscious intention or authorship, it is often mistaken for contemporary China. But it is not. It is a science fiction that already exists. This video essay is a retroactive manifesto for Sinofuturism, combining historical fantasy, documentary melodrama, and social realism with Chinese cosmologies. Although China only recently became the factory of the world, this is only the latest incarnation of the Chinese work ethic. It is a work ethic based on farm labor and large families, in an agrarian society prone to natural disasters, within a Confucian belief system that values hard work as the only insurance against a turbulent world. Multiple stereotypes of this Eastern other are everywhere. Whether Chinese Olympic athletes are branded as robots, or Chinese students or tourists are likened to swarms, or Shenzhen factory workers are criticized for flooding the marketplace. The subtext is the same. It is the dehumanization of the individual into a nameless, faceless mass. On the other hand is the Orientalist aesthetic narrative, where China is the exotic other, eternally unknowable, mysterious, powerless yet seductive. But rather than resisting cultural cliches, Sinofuturism embraces 7 key stereotypes associated with China. These are its guiding principles: computing, copying, gaming, studying, addiction, labor, and gambling. At a material level, it is already everywhere, in architecture, in the products and technologies that we use every day. However, I propose something more radical. I propose that Sinofuturism is in fact a form of artificial intelligence, a massively distributed neural network, focused on copying rather than originality, addicted to learning of massive amounts of raw data rather than philosophical critique or morality, with a post-human capacity for work, and an unprecedented sense of collective will to power. Rather than resisting stereotypes, Sinofuturism embraces cliches, many of which are reinforced by both East and West. Just as Afrofuturists answered the historical problem of slavery by declaring themselves as post-human super-robots, Sinofuturism answers the Chinese problems of physical servitude, intellectual conformity, and computational OCD by openly embracing artificial intelligence. In computer science, one of the most promising routes to developing AI is a combination of neural networks and machine learning. Here, an interconnected mesh of programmed neurons learn from sets of data based on real-world phenomena. Engineers declare that the results of neural networks are always surprising, especially in competition against humans. For a long time, grandmasters of the ancient game of Go considered themselves unbeatable against AI players. But in March 2016, the AlphaGo AI developed by Google DeepMind beat Go World Champion Lee Sedol by 4 games to 1. Most surprising was Lee's comment about some of AlphaGo's inhuman moves. He said he witnessed moves so profoundly unconventional that only a program could conceive them. This essential unknowability of the AI to the human, of the mystique of a consciousness beyond conventional understanding, is exactly the same other identified in Orientalism. It is this oppositional other which Sinofuturism identifies with, reorienting the technological narrative in a way that the nameless, faceless mass of Chinese labor becomes a collective body.
Well, thank you very much, Armen Avanessian, for actually being here at the ZHDK, and thank you everyone who watched this, and yeah, I hope I will see you all again now in the workshops. And of course also tonight again here on our YouTube channel of the ZHDK with the keynote by Ursula Biemann. So yeah, stay tuned. Thank you very much, and see you later.